All right, guys, today's lecture is going to be on Leonardo da Vinci, considered to be the greatest of all Renaissance men. He's an artist, a scientist, a mathematician, and of course, linked to the Medici family. Leonardo himself was born in Vinci. That's why Leonardo da Vinci means Leonardo of Vinci. It's a small town outside of Florence. He was discovered by the Medici clan when he was a young man, who fostered his training, his ideas, encouraged him. He was an inventor, a scientist. He wanted to understand the world around him using humanism and Greco-Roman ideas of science. He's famous for his drawings, his sculptures, his paintings, but perhaps most famous are his so-called modern machines, such as the helicopter and the glider. We'll talk about those in another slide. He is known as the quintessential Renaissance man. He is the one that when everyone looks back at the Renaissance in today's world, they say, oh, well, of course, the Renaissance is Da Vinci. Da Vinci was the Renaissance man, whereas Michelangelo was its greatest artist. So his art, of course, extremely famous. The picture on the right here is the Mona Lisa. It's actually in France at the Louvre. For a while, Leonardo worked for the King of France, and so this picture was done late in his life, in the 15th century, and sits in the Louvre Museum in Paris. The one on the right is supposedly a self-portrait. Self-portrait of Leonardo himself. We have nothing to confirm this, of course, but it's long suspected. This is actually in one of his journals that was found in his possessions when he died. So it's probable that this is what the artist looked like, or at least this is what the artist believed that he looked like. Perhaps his most famous large work, his most famous large artistic work, is called The Last Supper. For those who are not Christian, this is supposedly a representation of what's called Holy Thursday, the Thursday night before Jesus was arrested and handed over to the Romans. He and his disciples supposedly got together in Jerusalem and had a last meal, the Last Supper, if you will. There's a couple of things I want you to notice about this painting. Number one, it uses linear perspective. There's no question about the linear perspective here. Obviously going in from the sides, really focusing on Jesus, focusing the walls and what have you. So we know that Leonardo had studied some of Brunelleschi's work. He didn't study under Brunelleschi himself, but did study Brunelleschi's work while he was working for the Medici family. I also want you to notice how big it is. The frame underneath is actually a full-size door. This is, the Last Supper is painted on the wall of a church in Milan, Italy. And some years later, decades after the painting was done by Leonardo, long after he's dead, the church officials decided to put a door here to the outside wall. And you can see by the size of the door that the painting itself is massive. There's also a lot of problems with this painting. Unfortunately, this was a fresco painted on fresh plaster, and we think that when it was painted, the Last Supper was probably very vibrant in color. Today, that is not the case. Most artists, most art experts believe that the Last Supper probably only has about 50 years of life left in it. Unfortunately, the wall behind the Last Supper has cracked and exposed the interior parts of this stone and concrete wall to the elements, to the rain especially. And water has seeped in behind the paint, behind the plaster, and unfortunately has begun to deteriorate it from the inside out. And there's not much they can do about it. There's not much you can do to preserve something like that, because obviously in my classroom. So you can't preserve something like that. They've had to go in and try to fix it the best they can, but they're hoping that it lasts until the dawn of the 22nd century in 2100. If not, the world will lose one of the most recognizable pieces of art in all of human history. Leonardo is best known to many people for his science. Leonardo believed in humanism. The idea of humanism is that human beings, or man, can observe the world around him and figure it out. Leonardo was the ultimate humanist of the Renaissance. He really wanted to try to figure out the natural world around him. And that included the human body, as you can see here. Leonardo had a friend who worked in what we would call the morgue, worked in the cemetery, burying bodies. And for the right price, he could procure a body that wasn't wanted. It might have been a young prostitute who had died, or it might have been an old person who died, a young person who died who didn't have any family and what have you. And then Leonardo would get the body from his friend and would do scientific experiments, both in Vinci and also in his workshop in Florence. And then he would write about what he saw. He kept detailed journals in which he wrote backwards in them so that people couldn't figure it out. He wrote in a mirror image. But he would draw things like the shoulder. He would basically strip off the skin and cut the body open and figure out how it worked. The problem is, doing all of this went against church teaching, because the church at the time believed that Christian doctors should not be performing autopsies because the body itself belonged to God and needed to remain whole for Judgment Day. So Leonardo had enough really good friends, and he did this work in secret. And so much of his work was only published after his death. Published after his death. So as you can see, Leonardo did extremely detailed drawings, and some of his other pages, not shown here, would be things like the heart, the internal organs. He even had pictures of the lungs. He had pictures of the brain, the vessels and how they worked. It was extremely detailed, not just on humans. He also did animals. One of the ways he was able to figure out flight and how birds were able to fly is by literally dissecting the bird's wing and trying to figure out how it actually worked. And that was the whole key with Leonardo, was just trying to figure out the world around him. He also invented a number of military inventions, mostly for wartime use. His patrons, people paying him, often wanted something that would give them an advantage. What you're looking at here is Leonardo's ideas behind a tank. It was a one-person tank with a number of different gun turrets on it. And many of these inventions were hundreds of years ahead of their time. He came up with gliders, robots, tanks. He didn't have a concept of an engine to put in them. Everything was people powered, but he did come up with some amazing machines. Many of them were never actually built during his lifetime. But since then, some of his works have been built. This is a replica of what they believe Leonardo's tank would have looked like. It was built about 10 or 15 years ago. And you can see there are long wood planks that cover where the tank operator would sit. These wood planks are very thick. Tank is very heavy, and under pedal power, which is how it was designed, under pedal power, it only goes a couple miles an hour. It just kind of creeps along. But there are guns. You can see gun turrets that are down here below where the person would sit so that they could fire off rounds into an enemy. Again, this is primitive for today's standards, obviously, but the first working tank won't be seen until 1915 during the First World War, a little over 100 years ago. And Leonardo had come up with this in literally the early part of the 16th century, the early part of the 1500s. He was hundreds of years ahead of his time. He also had ideas for a machine gun. Again, a couple of different ideas for a machine gun. This one has been built as well. It's more like a rotating row of cannons, if you think about it. The cannons still have to be fired by hand, but then you would rotate the entire apparatus and rotate it down, and then the cannons themselves would rotate out of the way, and the next row of cannons would be brought up so that you could fire a number of different shots before you had to reload. Again, primitive for today, but certainly not primitive for the time period. So when we talk about Leonardo, hold on one second. When we talk about Leonardo da Vinci, one of the best known Renaissance artists. So he's an artist, an inventor, and scientist. He is what is known as a Renaissance man who wanted to know everything. He tried to use humanism to explore the world, and in the end, he is famous not only as a scientist, but also because of his realistic art. He is perhaps the most well-known scientist of the age, even though he is not the greatest artist of the age. Certainly a great artist, but not the greatest artist of the age. All right, I hope you guys took good notes, and be ready for a quiz. Make sure that you use the notes when you're doing the homework assignment. Thanks. Bye.